shut the system down in the case of a blackout. So why does the solar have to shut itself off if there's a blackout? Why can't you just use the solar? Well, because as we saw before, that extra current's going to go back onto the grid, and if everyone just had their system that they could be sending extra power out during a blackout, that's going to shock the line workers who are trying desperately to restore power to everyone else. So by default, solar inverters turn themselves off during a power outage. I mean, unfortunately, you don't have access to that solar energy, but it does keep things safe for the grid workers.
But that's contrary to why you have it. You have the solar panel to get electricity when you can't get it elsewhere.
No, you have to have batteries and things. You have to have storage.
You have to have a storage system. So the kind of systems that we install, unfortunately, do not operate during a blackout, and they're not designed to be a backup generator. They're designed to save you money on your energy bill. But of course, there are some inverters that offer some limited ways to access that power, and there's also the full-on Tesla Powerwall where you can be charging a battery and switch from grid-connected mode into a standalone mode. And as long as you can completely disconnect from the grid and go into a standalone mode where the extra power gets pumped into a battery, or when you fall short, the battery can supply the extra, then you can start to use the power when the grid is down. But it gets a lot more complicated electrically, and making sure that that's a reliable thing that's always going to happen, that it's never going to send power back to the grid. But I'll just take a minute to point out the SMA central inverter. That's not what we're using today, but it's an option for a central inverter where it does offer you a single 120 volt outlet that's powered directly by the solar panels. The reason it can do this is because it will match the power of the solar panels to exactly what you're demanding from your plug. I think it goes up to it goes up to 20 amps now. You can put a 20 amp plug on it. You can't run your normal house wiring off of it, but you can plug an extension cord into it, and maybe at best run a fridge or some small appliances, certainly run your laptop, charge your phone. It's a way to access that power, but because there's no batteries involved, it has to constantly tweak that maximum power point curve and tweak the voltage such that the amount of power is matching the amount that you're demanding in real time. So it's kind of an interesting electrical feat that it's performing there, but it does offer some form of limited backup power without the use of the battery. But even when it's doing that, it is completely disconnected from the grid, and it's routing all that power to a single 120 volt circuit with one line and one neutral.
So is the inverter also smart enough to know when the power grid is up and running again and restart the system?
Yes, although you have to do a manual switch when you want to switch it over to that dedicated plug.
Yeah,
and
if
so
you're
you
not
have
using
to.
the dedicated plug,
Yeah.
just in general.
In general, if you're not putting it into manual mode, then yeah, it's just going to automatically turn back on when the grid. In fact, it's just constantly going to be testing during the entire power outage. It's going to test for when it detects the grid comes back on, and then it's going to wait for 5 minutes to make sure that the grid's not fluctuating on and off. And when it sees that the grid is within normal range for 5 minutes, that's when it'll kick back on automatically. So you don't have to worry about calling your solar installer every time there's a power outage.
Or even going out and pressing a switch.
Yeah, you don't have to do anything. It will come back on its own. Even the SMA one, it might take a full day-night cycle, but after the next morning, if you forget to turn the manual switch off, it'll still generally go back into grid operating mode the day after it notices that the grid's come back on. So even if you forget or you're on vacation and someone left the manual switch on, it'll still ultimately go back into normal operation. So system performance monitoring, that's the other thing that the inverter does for you, whether this is microinverters or whether it's a central inverter. It gives you a way to know how much power you're producing, independent of just checking your PG&E bill. You might want to know in real time how much power you're making. So generally, they either have a display, or more and more they're moving toward web-based monitoring, where they've kind of taken away the display down to a minimum, and they just ask you to go to an online web portal. It'll connect to your Wi-Fi, and then you can read it online. But either way, you can get access to the information of how many kilowatts you're producing, how much you've historically produced. It'll keep a log of how much generation you've had. Here's that maximum power point tracking curve I talked about. So the green line is what it would be in more shady conditions or overcast, and then the blue line is when there's more sun, and then like I talked about, that maximum power point is going to be at a different place in the curve. It's going to be a slightly different voltage, not by much, but that's what the inverter has to figure out, as where to set that voltage, that you get the right balance of amperage and voltage. So what about shade? Say you're not in a perfect condition where all the panels are getting the same amount of sunlight at the same time. That's where microinverters help, and that's what we're using in this case. I don't think we have a lot of shade, although there are some other advantages to microinverters, like better monitoring. But this is what we're going to be using today. This is an example of some M250 microinverters. We're going to be installing the latest generation of IQ inverters, but they all work about the same way. You have the panel plugged directly into the DC side of the little tiny inverter that's about this big. That inverter sits right there on the rail on the roof. And then the inverters themselves are chained together in parallel so that they all maintain that 240 volts no matter how many microinverters you put in place. You can, when you put the microinverters in parallel, what's going to happen is instead of the voltage adding up, the current is going to add up. So they maintain that 240 volts between line 1 and line 2, but more and more current goes the more microinverters you put in the chain. In the case of the microinverters we're going to be installing today, the most you can put on one chain is 13 before you hit the limit of, the hard limit is 16 amps per circuit, which corresponds to a 20 amp breaker. You're supposed to be 80% of the breaker handle rating, so you're not constantly tripping the breaker. Anyway, it's about 1.21 amps per microinverter, and the math adds up that you can do 13 per chain. So we're going to be doing two different circuits of up to 13 microinverters.
So do those micros take the place of the inverter that you showed this picture of on the side of the house?
That's right. And what they will have is a combiner box, but that's just a purely AC box, sort of like a sub panel. It's going to house your monitor. So similar to an inverter, it will take care of the monitoring, but also it's going to be like a little breaker panel where you can have the two circuits come together into one, and it gets placed next to your service panel, or in this case the sub panel that he has in the service room. So it's not an inverter, but there will be a central box, but it's kind of a lighter duty box. It's not doing as much as a full inverter. It's just kind of collecting all those AC circuits together.
So what happens if one of the microinverters goes bad?
Good question. Well, first of all, the monitoring is on an individual panel basis, so not only will you know if a panel goes bad, you can also figure out if a microinverter goes bad, and not only that, but you know exactly which one, because you're going to have a map of where the different serial numbers are located. One of the things you have to remember to do before you put the panels up is peel the little serial number sticker off of each one and put it on a map that tells us the exact location. We're going to program that into the computer so that you have a kind of a real-time map of which panels are producing how much power, and you can tell if one of the panels, not only if it goes out completely because of a bad microinverter, but also you can tell that maybe a panel is only producing half as much as it should be. In a series system, one panel will slow down all the rest of the panels, and it might realize that there's one particular panel that's getting all the bird droppings or something. With a microinverter system, you can identify that from your monitoring at the computer, and then you can go and look on the roof and see, oh, I see what happened. We need to clean that one panel.
Are we going to have access to this monitoring? Is it going to go into our office computer?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to set up with Larry, and he can share that account password with however many people he wants. I'll also have access to it, so if you guys identify a problem or what looks like a problem, then you can bring it to my attention. I can log in with my account and view your data as well. So I'll have an installer account. You guys will have the account for the user, and both of us will be able to see the individual panel metrics.
Yeah, so the Enphase is the manufacturer of the inverter, and then you go to the Enphase website and they have your account on it, and then you can kind of see the.
That's what we have at home.
Oh, they'll say
We have
Enphase.
that, and then our solar company also has our information, so they can see what's going on.
Yeah, so there's a lot of good advantages to microinverters, and like I said, if you had just a central inverter, if there's a problem, you might not be able to identify where it is because you only have system-wide monitoring, not individual panel monitoring.
Do we need to protect those from the rain? Are we going to install where they'll be beyond exposed today?
All right, your question was, do we need to protect the microinverters from the rain? Well, first of all, they're going to be under the panels, so they're not going to get a lot of direct rain on them. But even if they did, even if you were, say, servicing a panel and you took it off and then it rained the next day, everything that goes on the roof is going to be designed for all the elements that they might encounter. The microinverters, we're on the wrong slide here, but the microinverter looks like that, is completely enclosed. It's, I think, NEMA 4X water rain, which means that it can be in any orientation and be rained on. Like pretty much anything short of actually dunking it in a pool, it can stay watertight. But yeah, any amount of rain, it's designed to be out there in the elements, just like a standard central inverter that you hang on the wall would be watertight. These are watertight, plus they're under the panels, so they're not going to get rained on directly in general use. So just want to quickly also touch on another alternative that we had considered, which is sort of a middle-of-the-road option where you have still a central inverter, but you're still worried about maybe shade concerns, or you want to have a way to have individual panel monitoring. So in this case, you can use a power optimizer, which does a DC to DC conversion. It allows each panel to set individual maximum power point for the light conditions of that panel. But instead of converting it to full grid quality AC power at each individual unit under the panel, it just does a quick conversion to DC power, and it creates kind of a consistent DC current. These actually get connected in series, and they always kind of manipulate their voltage and current on the output side such that the total chain adds up to 380 volts, or in some cases, the bigger inverters, they'll go up to 400 volts. That way, the inverter can run more efficiently because it doesn't have to accept a wide range of input voltages, and you get a lot of the same advantages that you have with microinverters, but for less cost because each individual optimizer is cheaper than a full-on microinverter. So the bigger the system gets, the more cost savings you'll see out of having optimizers, because you're not duplicating the function of the inverter for every panel that you have. So it's another option that's, again, kind of a cross between central inverter and microinverters. So at this point in the presentation, in case anyone was sleeping, this is where we're going to start going into the safety portion. So time to wake up.
Very good.
Now we're going to talk about the hazards of solar installation, and in case you can't read that, this is a little far side comment that says, now this is the end we call the Thagmizer, after the late Thag Simmons. Just not really related to solar, but a funny comic to get you guys in the mindset of thinking about safety. So safety first, we already talked about the power drop from PG&E, how we want to keep our distance from that and recognize that that's high voltage lines, and it doesn't have a breaker controlling it either. It's going to be pretty much an unlimited source of power coming directly from the power lines, and if you touch the red and the black wire at the same time with different hands, you'll have 240 volts running across your heart. But even just touching one side and having your knee scrape against the metal can make a pretty bad shock, at least 120 volts, and again with really no limit on the amount of current. So we want to leave those wires alone. We're going to kind of talk about the different steps involved, and I'm going to kind of point out safety elements as we go along. One of the first things that's going to happen, in fact I already started to do it on this roof, is marking out the array, so marking out where the corners of each panel is going to be located. Then after we figure out where the rafters are, I'll be drilling the pilot holes, and then I'm going to train you guys, and the volunteers are going to be putting sealant around the pilot holes, filling in any pilot holes that may be missed. I'm going to mark with white chalk line which one is the good one that's associated with the rafter. Any ones that aren't a rafter need to be filled in with sealant, and then you want to make a circle, like a little tight donut of sealant right around the hole that we're going to use. That way, when the flashing goes on top, it's going to compress that sealant and squish the sealant around the lag screw. So here's our Iron Ridge flashing, what it looks like when it's in place. Again, you would have had a donut of sealant right around the screw that you put in ahead of time. You carefully push the flashing in without smearing out the sealant too much. And then by the time you run the lag screw down, it's going to compress to the roof and squish all that sealant and make a watertight seal. And then the flashing itself is wide